Welcome to Surface Knowledge, the only podcast that provides you with useless information for a useful reason. Never again be stuck without an interesting tidbit or fun fact in any social situation. Here's your host, Max Curtin.
Welcome back, Surface Dwellers, to the 6th episode of Surface Knowledge, where this week we're going to be talking about the wonderful musical genre that is punk rock. Now, there's going to be no disclaimer from here on out. There's been 5 episodes now. You know enough to do your own research. And remember, punkers, this is Surface Knowledge, so don't get your old plaid knickers in a twist if I don't talk about your favorite bands or specific things that happen at shows. We're trying to do an overview here for people interested in the genre. Now, myself, I am a huge lover of punk rock. And even though I'd say my music taste has changed and broadened over the years, I'm always going to be a punker at heart. I've been fortunate enough to see some of the best punk bands of the past 20 and 30 years. I've interviewed some punk legends, and I've even somehow gone to the Punk Rock Museum in Las Vegas, which if you ever are in the desert, I recommend you go and check out. Now, saying all of that, let's get controversial from the get-go, seeing as that's the theme of the episode. As someone who's loved this music almost their entire life, there is a lot of gatekeeping and rules for something so rebellious. There's all these arguments online, shocker I know, about what is punk and what is punk rock. And to be honest with you, it's kind of exhausting and dizzying. With any typical movement or genre of music, there are going to be subsets of everything, as people take the general idea and they make it fit what speaks to them personally. This is why we have punk, punk rock, pop punk, ska punk, glam punk, proto-punk, first wave, hardcore, new wave, post-punk, alt-rock, skate punk, queercore, riot girl, oi, and anarcho-punk, cyberpunk, just to name a few. And my favorite ever distinction comes from Joe Strummer from The Clash. He said, all punk is rock, but not all rock is punk. So in reality, I could spend the next 30 minutes talking about the rules, man, about what classifies punk rock, but I don't think there are any rules to it, as it comes down to kind of the attitude and belief. So if you forgive me, dear listener, I've got a solution for this podcast and this podcast alone that's going to make my life a little bit easier. And then you can all go fight about it in the comments. One, we're going to treat as the broader term, encompassing the subculture, fashion, and attitude associated with the music, extending beyond the specified genre. Punk rock is going to be defined as a specific musical genre that emerged in the mid-1970s that we categorize by raw, fast-paced, and sometimes politically charged sound. Punk rock has changed. It's evolved over the decades. So we had the early days of garage rock. Then we had the first wave of punk rock. That can easily be defined from 76 to 80. Then there was a decline in the 80s as subgenres diversified. There was an underground revival in the 90s and 2000s, and then pop-punk became the final trend, followed by mainstream popularity decline in the 2010s. I think that's fair. Intro sorted. So if you're all happy with that and you're ready, punkers, I say let's gain a surface knowledge of punk rock. All right, 30 minutes on the clock, definitions are out of the way. Let's talk about how punk rock actually started. And of course, with everything punk related, there's some debate. But most music historians agree that the roots of punk can be traced back to the late 1960s and early 1970s, with a bunch of bands that weren't quite punk yet, but there was definitely that punk energy. We call this era Proto-Punk. It's not a genre per se, but it's more like a vibe. You got to think raw sound, anti-establishment lyrics, zero interest in being polished. We're talking bands like MC5. They had their iconic song Kick Out the Jams. You had the Stooges, which was fronted by the beautiful half-naked Iggy Pop. And then you had Def, which were a black punk band from Detroit who were way ahead of their time. These were the bands that kind of kicked that door down. And the term punk rock itself started showing up in music journalism around the early 1970s. One of the first uses came from Ed Sanders, who was a poet and a member of the Thugs, who used punk rock in a 1970 album title. But it wasn't until Lester Bangs, the legendary music critic, started throwing the term around in Cream magazine that it began sticking to this loose but loud new sound. So a question with punk rock is, what were they rebelling against? Why were they singing this way? Why were they playing this way? And the answer is they were rebelling against pretty much everything. Punk was a reaction. It was a violent, sarcastic reaction to this kind of bloated, overproduced excess of 70s arena rock and these flower child idealisms of the 60s. If you had long solos, gone. Matching outfits, technical perfection, no thank you. Punk was about stripping it all back. It was about turning up the amp and playing free chords with more attitude than talent. But here's the thing, punk wasn't just music. Obviously, as we've established from the start, it was a subculture. It was a political stance and it was a whole aesthetic. It was sneering at authority, it was making your own zines, it was turning your clothes into armor. If you couldn't afford cool clothes, you ripped what you had and you stuck a safety pin through it. If you couldn't get on the radio, you started your own tape label. If nobody wanted to book you, you played in a basement. That's what became known as the DIY ethic. Do it yourself. Not because it's trendy, but because nobody else is going to do it for you. It was confrontational, it was weird, and it made quite a lot of people uncomfortable. Which, in hindsight, was obviously the point. By the early to mid 70s, this energy started to coalesce into actual scenes, and it kind of happened almost simultaneously in two places. You had New York City and London, and this is where we get to that first real wave of capital P punk rock. But before we hit the CBGBs and safety pins, just remember this. Punk wasn't born in a boardroom. It wasn't designed, it wasn't refined, and it definitely wasn't planned. This was a messy explosion of frustration, noise, and rebellion. And in my mind, and for my money, and in my heart, that's kind of what makes it beautiful. So if Proto-Punk was the spark, then 1974 to 1980 was the full-blown Molotov cocktail. Punk rock officially had its first wave and it came crashing out of two cities that couldn't have been more different. We got New York and London. So if we start over in the Big Apple, it's the early 1970s. Manhattan is crumbling, crime is through the roof, and then you got downtown clubs like CBGB and Max's Kansas City, a ground zero for people looking for a place to belong. You've got bands like Television playing jagged poetic noise. You've got Patti Smith fusing poetry with proto-punk sound and turning beatniks into punks. And of course, the staple of all, you got the Ramones, the true blueprints. Their songs were short, they were fast, they were loud, and they were catchy. Let's agree pop might be an overplayed earworm oldie song to you now, but it's practically punk DNA. It is arguably the catalyst for everything that comes next. We got four guys in leather jackets playing 2-minute songs that sound like they're written in the back of a speeding cab. The New York scene was artsy, it was gritty, and it was proudly underground. These weren't trained musicians, they were ex-junkies, they were poets and misfits who couldn't get booked anywhere else, so they made their own stage, literally and figuratively. Fashion-wise, we got Richard Hell, who deserves a massive shout-out here. With ripped clothes, spiked hair, and that kind of I don't care sneer, he practically invented the punk look. Malcolm McLaren, who was the future manager of the Sex Pistols, even said that Hell inspired the fashion that would soon ignite London. And speaking of my dear old London, if New York gave punk a sound, then I'd say that London gave it teeth. By the mid-70s, Britain was deep in economic crisis. You've got unemployment, class division, and youth disenfranchisement were everywhere. So when punk landed, it wasn't just a sound, it turned into a revolution. The Sex Pistols were patient zero. Formed in 1975 and fronted by butter-loving Johnny Rotten, they were offensive, they were aggressive, and they were everything the establishment feared. Their debut single, Anarchy in the UK, it wasn't just a song, you'd almost classify it as a declaration of war. Their infamous live TV appearance in 1976, where they cursed out broadcaster Bill Grundy on live broadcast, led to public outrage and newspaper headlines labeling punk as the filth and the fury. And predictably, that just made kids love it more. Then we had The Clash. These are more politically driven, musically expansive, and more socially aware. The Clash took punk's raw power and they fused it with reggae, ska, and dub, and Joe Strummer, their charismatic frontman, gave punk its conscience. They weren't just there to tear things down, they wanted to build something better in its place that would last. And we can't forget about other first wavers. You got the Buzzcocks, who were catchier, more melodic punk that still kept the attitude. X-Ray Specs were fronted by the fierce Polly Styrene, which is the greatest stage name of all time, and was one of the first women of color in punk, singing about identity, consumerism, and alienation. Then you had Susie and the Banshees, whose dark, artsy sound helped pave the way for post-punk and goth. So punk in the UK wasn't a scene, it was a full-on movement by this point. Kids were forming bands overnight, they were starting zines, they were sewing patches on their jacket, and the message they were sending was clear. You don't need permission, just pick up a guitar and scream. This wasn't about getting famous, it wasn't about getting heard. And even though punk had a relatively short first wave lifespan, by 1980 many early bands had either broken up, they'd been banned, or they'd gone in other directions. But what it did is it laid the groundwork for everything that came next. Punk rock wasn't just a genre of music anymore, it was a state of mind. So punk rock had exploded, but with any explosion, the aftermath was messy. By the early 1980s, the first wave was either burning out, it was breaking up, or in some cases, getting co-opted. But punk didn't die, it just mutated. So what followed were waves of subgenres that pushed punk in every direction, making it louder, faster, more political, more melodic, and more theatrical, and sometimes even more confused. It was pure chaos, but at the same time, it was productive chaos. Let's first talk about hardcore. If you think that the Ramones were fast, hardcore was like punk on espresso, coke, and rage. This new breed stripped things down even further. Songs got shorter, tempos got faster, and the aggression got turned up to 11. Lyrics were less about fashion and more about frustration, politics, alienation, poverty, violence. You had bands like Black Flag from California. They've got this raw, sludgy, and completely uncompromising sound. Minor Threat from DC, fast, furious, and founding the kind of straight edge movement. You got Dead Kennedys out of San Francisco. They were politically savage and satirical. Bad Brains in DC. They were a pioneering black punk band who fused hardcore with reggae and had the kind of live energy that could probably peel paint off the walls. Hardcore scenes popped up in every city from Boston, New York, LA to DC. It was local, it was underground, and it was completely self-sufficient. Meanwhile, back over in the UK, Oi emerged as a more street-level version of punk, often tied to working-class identity. Bands like Cockney Rejects, The Exploited, and Sham 69, they sang about real-life struggles. They wanted to sing about unemployment. They wanted to sing about football and class warfare. But Oi also came with controversy. Some fans and scenes were co-opted by far-right groups, leading to ongoing debates about the politics of the genre. Punk had always been political, but now it was getting polarizing. With neo-Nazi punks, this led to a divide in punk groups, and these mixes of neo-Nazi punks and regular punks were starting to come together at shows with vastly different ideologies as the anti-racist punk movement was picking up steam. A famous example of this frustration of attempted neo-Nazi punks trying to take over a whole genre was Dead Kennedy's famous response song, Nazi Punks, Fuck Off. The lyrics condemned the infighting among punks for weakening the prospect of rebelling against far-right agitators. From this tension came anarcho-punk, pioneered by bands like Crass, who rejected not just mainstream society, but the very idea of structure itself. No corporate gigs, no major labels, no compromise. Their songs were anti-war, anti-consumerism, basically anti-everything. They even printed manifestos on their album sleeves. When we had queercore, which came in the 80s as a response to the homophobia in both the punk scene and society at large. Bands like Pansy Division and Team Dresch used punk to celebrate queer identity and rage against exclusion. In the 90s, a feminist punk explosion called Riot Grrrl kicked off in Olympia, Washington and Washington, D.C., led by bands like Bikini Kill, Bratmobile, and Heavens to Betsy. The movement wasn't just about music, it was about zines, safe spaces, activism, and confronting misogyny in both punk and the wider world. Their DIY feminist ethos inspired generations of young women, non-binary folks, and anyone who didn't feel seen in traditional punk spaces. Riot Grrrl wasn't just loud, it was liberating. By the late 80s and into the 90s, punk was diversifying hard. Skate punk was fast, fun, and loaded with melody. This was perfect for shredding pavements and hopping fences. You got bands like NoFX, Pennywise, and Lagwagon. They became staples of the SoCal scene and those Warped Tour soundtracks. At the early to mid-90s, if you would ask someone if punk was still alive, then you might have heard the classic, "Punk's dead, man." But then, almost out of nowhere, it came back swinging. This time, it wasn't from the underground, but it was from your local FM radio and eventually MTV's Total Request Live. If we jump back in time to 1994, that is the year that Green Day's Dookie and Offspring's Smash hit like sonic wrecking balls. Suddenly, punk, or at least something like it, was everywhere again. Green Day took punk's attitude and they repackaged it with tight hooks, pop sensibility, and just enough sneer to make sure that parents didn't get that nervous. Billy Joe Armstrong, with his nasally voice and the snotty lyrics and that kind of irrelevant energy, connected with a whole new generation. On the other side of the coin, you had The Offspring, who brought California skate punk to the masses, with songs like Come Out and Play and Self-Esteem. These were fast, sarcastic, and radio-ready. Their success was proof that punk could go platinum without losing all of its bite. And just for context to people who didn't know, these albums weren't just successful, they were blockbusters. Dookie sold over 10 million copies in the US alone. Smash became the best-selling indie release ever at the time. Suddenly, major labels were hunting for punk-adjacent bands like record company Truffle Pigs. From the late 90s into the 2000s, bands like Blink-182, Sum 41, Good Charlotte, Simple Plan, and many others took that punk energy and filtered it through suburban angst, catchy choruses, and just enough eyeliner to make it Hot Topic compatible. It was punk with jokes, it was punk with hooks, punk that wore Dickie shorts and wrote songs about girls and gym class and generational boredom. Blink-182 had songs like What's My Age Again and All the Small Things. They made fart jokes and heartbreak kind of go hand in hand, and somehow, for some reason, it really worked. And let me make one thing perfectly clear. Old school punkers? They fucking hated it. For millions of kids who had never set foot in a basement show, this was their gateway drug. At the center of this mainstream rise was the Warped Tour. This started in 1995, and it kind of became a summer pilgrimage for punk fans. It blended music, skateboarding, and counterculture into this kind of sweaty, sunburny melting pot. Bands were discovered there, scenes were made there. It was kind of this part circus, part punk camp, and part, well, merch booth, basically. And speaking of merch, punk fashion went commercial. Hot Topic became the one-stop shop for band tees, wallet chains, and studded belts. Suddenly, punk wasn't something you thrifted, it was now something that you bought at the mall. And again, the question, was that punk? And again, the answer depends who you ask. But the commercialization was impossible to ignore. Punk had once screamed no future, and now it was getting nominated for Grammys. Despite all of the commercialization, some bands still managed to sneak in real messages under the pop sheen. Let's take Green Day again for an example. American Idiot in 2004 was a massive, politically charged concept album about the post-9/11 disillusionment. It was angry, it was theatrical, and surprisingly punk in its heart. Even if it was performed on Broadway 10 years later. But you had other bands like Anti-Flag, Rise Against, and Against Me who brought politics back into the conversation. They helped offer a counterbalance to the more sugary pop punk that dominated the charts at the time. And then on the heavier side, you had bands like AFI, My Chemical Romance, and Alkaline Trio that bridged punk with goth and emo aesthetics that created an entirely new subcultural hybrid. By the late 2000s, though, the boom started to fade. TRL went off the air, Warped Tour got smaller and smaller until it disappeared, MySpace bands came and went, pop music shifted directions, and once again, people started whispering, punk is dead. But like before, it wasn't dead, it was just morphing again. So here we are, decades after punk first kicked open the doors with CBGB and spat on the front row. The outfits have changed, the sounds have evolved, the eyeliner might be waterproof now, but one thing for sure, punk is not dead. It just keeps finding new places to live, because punk was never just about the music. It was about saying no to systems that didn't work. It was about creating your own path when none existed. It was politics with a guitar, rage with a rhythm, rebellion with a beat. Even when it got packaged and sold, even when it showed up in movies, commercials, or Broadway, punk's core remained. Challenge the norm. Punk gave us more than just a sound, it gave us a framework, a toolkit for resistance, identity, and survival. It birthed entire movements. It inspired feminist waves through Riot Girl. It gave voice to queer identities long before the mainstream inclusion. It challenged class divides, racism, and policing through anarcho-punk and hardcore. It gave the outsider, the freak, the kid with no voice a stage, or at least a basement and a microphone. It also changed how music is made and distributed. The DIY ethic championed by early punk became the foundation for indie labels, zines, and digital self-publishing today. Every band that you love that started in a garage with a $200 mic, they owe a little something to punk. And punk's influence goes beyond music. In fashion, punk aesthetics continue to resurface, from runway shows to resale trends. In politics, punk gave us slogans and symbols that still resonate today. And in attitude, punk lives on in every act of creative defiance, every middle finger raised, every time someone says no to something they don't believe in, even if it makes them an outsider. It's also generational. Every decade gets its own flavor of punk, its own group of angry, inspired misfits shouting into the void. And as long as teenagers exist, as long as someone feels out of place, as long as people want to fight back against whatever system is failing them, then punk will never go away. Because punk isn't about being in tune or on trend. It's about being loud when you're supposed to be quiet. It's about not asking for permission. It's about starting the band before you know how to play. Or, as Kurt Cobain once put it, punk rock should mean freedom, liking and accepting anything that you like. Thanks for joining me on this impassioned swooning over my favorite music genre of punk rock. I hope I did it justice, and I look forward to doing more music genres in the future. If you did like this episode, consider giving the show a 5-star rating wherever you're listening, and follow us on Instagram, Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok, all at Surface Knowledge Pod, for exclusive clips and more additional facts. Helps us grow, helps others find the show, and it gives me excuses to talk about stuff that I enjoy talking about. And as always, if you want to scream your opinion at me in all caps or suggest a future topic, then email me at gottill5@gmail.com. I'll be back next week where we're going to be gaining a surface knowledge of ghost ships. See you then, punkers.
You've been listening to the Surface Knowledge Podcast, part of the GT5 network. Be sure to subscribe and rate on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. We'll see you back here soon for another episode. Until next time, stay curious.